Okay, we're at 12 o'clock. All right, so we're going to get started. I want to leave as much time for Q&A as possible. Welcome, everybody. Let me just do some logistical stuff up front. Some Zoom tips. There's the up arrow, the little caret there, helps you select from your audio and from your video, if you're doing video, although participants aren't doing video, but you can get your audio settings. You can also click on the closed captioning. There's a closed captioning button that you can use. It may be in different places on your screen, depending on how you have your screen set up, but we do have closed captioning available, and we've pinned the ASL interpreter up on the video as well. We've spotlighted the ASL so that they're on the top. We've also, for folks who would like to use see multiple speakers alongside, under options, you can do a side-by-side mode, which allows you to see multiple presenters as well as the screen. There's also gallery view where you can see all the speakers at once. Well, welcome. This webinar is being recorded. We will post it later on disabilitycompendium.org on our website. This website is where you can find the compendium, the annual report, all the materials that we present if you don't have a copy already. This website is also where you can find the slides for today, for each day, and the speaker bios, the list of speakers and their bios. As an attendee of the webinar, you are a viewer only. To ask questions, click on the Q&A box on the webinar and type in your question. Speakers will provide answers either live or sometimes during the presentations. I'll type out some answers if I can answer questions. I'm hoping that we have a lot of good time for Q&A because we'll hear a lot of good stuff today. If you have any questions after the webinar, you can contact us at disability.statistics@unh.edu or at our toll-free number 866-538-9521. Okay, for more information. So I'm going to turn it over to Kirstin Painter at NIDILRR, and who's our moderator for today, and she's going to introduce the session and the first speaker. Take it away, Kirstin.
All right. All right, thank you, Andrew. Happy Wednesday, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I get to introduce the four speakers for today, who will be discussing federal data collection and adjusting to the COVID environment. First, we'll have Jason Fields. Dr. Fields is a senior researcher in the Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division at the U.S. Census Bureau. He will be presenting on the topic of rapid changes to the U.S. Census household surveys and data collection during COVID-19. Then we'll have Julie Weeks. Dr. Weeks is Chief of the Aging and Chronic Disease Statistics Branch in the National Center for Health Statistics at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Dr. Weeks will be presenting on health data. And following her, Michelle Dressner, a labor economist, the Office of Compensation and Working Conditions at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. She will be presenting on the Occupational Requirement Survey. And then finally, Chris McLaren, a senior economist in the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor, will be presenting on disability employment data and trends during COVID-19. And with that, I will hand it over to Chris.
Actually, I think you're handing it over to Jason first, right?
Yep, I just need to be able to share my screen.
Oh, I've got to stop sharing. Sorry. Take it away.
Hopefully that's coming through now.
I can see it at least, yep.
Yep. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Certainly, you can imagine that there's a lot to talk about in terms of adapting to the COVID pandemic as far as our Census Bureau data collections. So, all right, it's not advancing. Okay, so I'll be talking a bit about the process and personnel changes that we experienced here at Census. Go over a little bit of our what changes we made to our existing household and business surveys. Talk about the some examples of non-survey data products that were particularly valuable during this period. Talk about 2 new surveys, which is our pulse surveys, with a focus on the household pulse survey, and then a bit about the health impacts. So there's a lot to cover, and I will try to get through it all as quickly here as we can. So what was going on? There was all of our in-person surveys. Obviously, we stopped going and knocking on doors. Surveys that were conducted in person largely switched to telephone contact, either from surveys that were initially set up as telephone contact surveys and in-person surveys. Both transitioned to call telephone surveys from our interviewers' houses. So we decentralized the telephone survey operations. Paper surveys largely relied on their online data collection tools, such as the ACS and other surveys. And paper invitations, we had to substitute for email invitations. And that's a strategy that the Household Pulse Survey and the Business Pulse Survey have used. Sampling strategies were adjusted to provide additional data on frames. We used administrative data in ways that we hadn't done so in production before. And of course, all of this was going on at a time where our workforce was also decentralized and shifting to full-time telework. And for most of our areas, mandatory. Our processing centers were shut down, and the telephone centers were shut down. Okay, so this was an environment where we saw a need, and we tried to innovate, and we were able to push a few boundaries and get some experimentation done. So as an overview, what I'll be talking about are if you think about this rubric with the businesses and households for existing surveys, we made changes to our annual business surveys and capital expenditure surveys, survey manufacturers, et cetera, and the economic indicators. On the household side, these are not the only surveys that the Census Bureau conducts, but these are the ones where the Census Bureau is a primary sponsor. And operations changed for all of these. American Community Survey, the Current Population Survey, and the SIP all went to phone interviewing and use of non-contact methods. We developed some additional data in the business formation statistics and created a new product called Community Resilience Estimates, and developed 2 new surveys. So existing surveys. The annual business survey shifted, which measures the ability of workers to work from home, shifted to telephone collection. And the rest of these surveys all had questions added or some additional changes that would help measure the impact of the pandemic on the economic sectors. On the household side, the American Community Survey revised messaging, altered the mail-out strategy, made sampling adjustments to account for differential contact areas, and the contact strategy, again, shifted to telephone. For the Current Population Survey, at the request of the National Center for Education Statistics, we added 7 questions about the pandemic on schooling at the individual level, and the availability of computers and digital devices, a concept which was also added to the Household Pulse Survey. And concerns about coronavirus were added as an answer category to 2 questions in the November voting supplement. For the SIP, there were more changes that were put in place. The SIP is a longitudinal survey, so there's a bit more integration of the COVID experience into the answer categories. During our data collection, which we were in the field from February through June, we did shift to telephone interviewing. For this upcoming SIP administration, which is in the field now, answer lists were modified to allow for pandemic as a response category. Content was added on the receipt of the economic stimulus payments, and new content was added on several categories related to how families experienced the pandemic. SIP will be uniquely valuable because it will capture longitudinal program participation, employment, and other characteristics as families transition in and out of the workforce. Okay, moving on quickly here to our non-survey data. The business formation statistics. This is an experimental public use file that was designed to fill the gap between and provide high frequency information on new business formations. Previously, these data were available quarterly, but through the pandemic, we worked to develop a more rapid use of the input data to provide contents on business applications, identifying applications with high propensity for paying wages, etc. And this was done collaboratively with the Federal Reserve of Atlanta, and the University of Maryland and Notre Dame. On the household side, we worked internally to develop a product which could provide small area geographical information about the ability of a community to withstand different conditions. So resilience is a measure that has a long research history. It's a focus on health and social and economic impacts. And these data are generated through model-based estimates, combining information from the American Community Survey and from the National Health Interview Survey and other administrative inputs. The community resilience estimates are available online on the website. You can scroll down to drill into tracks, and you can understand a bit about why some communities might have greater impacts from certain conditions or than others. Okay. The household pulse surveys. Both of these were brand new surveys and ground up operations that were initiated between about March 13th to the 20th, and both went into the field in April. So both the econ side and the demographic side of the Census Bureau really did unprecedented work to get these surveys in the field. The Small Business Pulse Survey really focuses on the effects of the pandemic on businesses overall, and looking at their operations, finances, the workforce, and tries to produce high frequency geographic and industry detail. The email invitations, again, were used from the business register. The economic censuses already have some infrastructure for contacting businesses by email. This was very valuable. The response rate at the business level was greater than 25%. And we are currently in, I think, the third phase of collection, and an additional phase is planned. Importantly, the Census Bureau conducted this survey and the household pulse, but conducted this in partnership with a pretty wide range of other federal partners. The Small Business Administration, the Federal Reserve Board, International Trade, Minority Businesses, Development Agency, the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, Office of Tax Analysis, Department of Treasury, and Bureau of Labor Statistics were all partners, along with the Office of Management and Budget. The content in the Small Business Pulse survey focuses on the effect of the pandemic, the operations changes to businesses, supply chain challenges, finance, looking at cash on hand, and the ability to provide and receive assistance, and the expectations. So moving into an area that the Census Bureau doesn't necessarily always collect data, which is attitudes and expectations. On the Household Pulse survey, again, it was really a response to our data collection infrastructure, not letting us go in person, by phone, by mail. We developed a interviewing platform that leveraged a system that we used for testing and instrument development, and added data to the master address file frame from what we call a contact frame, which has existing email and cell phone numbers. And these numbers were used to contact directly to respondents. And the coverage of the combined sets of frames was over 80% of the household population. We also have partners in the household side, working with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the National Center for Health Statistics, Housing and Urban Development, the National Center for Education Statistics, the Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, and the Office of Management and Budget. In addition to those, we've added the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, the Social Security Administration, and coming in March is the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. Our content focuses on the different domains that households experience the impacts of the pandemic, from employment to food security, several items in about health, housing, education, program use, and spending. Okay.
Jason, you're about the 3-minute mark.
Yep, got it. So a few highlighted health impacts. So for one of the biggest things that the Household Pulse has really shed a light on is mental health, in a way that I don't think that another survey has been able to do this. We took items with the National Center for Health Statistics from the health interview survey. And these are the PHQ and the GAD2 scale. And so each of these measures anxiety and depression, or one measures anxiety and one measures depression. It's not the full scale that are used in the other survey, but it is a tested and validated component. The metrics here that I'm showing show the impact of the pandemic. There's a gap between July and August, which represents a break in series, a change in our instrument. But these show a general very high level of trends in adults feeling anxious, having lost interest, feeling worried, feeling down, that continue across the time and have only been increasing. The National Center for Health Statistics combines those measures into an anxiety measure and a depression measure. And as a comparison of the levels that we're seeing now, the National Health Interview Survey from January to June of 2019 estimated these same measures at 8.2% for anxiety, of which we are over 30%, and 6.6% for depressive symptoms, which we're over 25% now. Additionally, in January, we've also added a couple questions on vaccinations and the presence of having had a COVID diagnosis. So the likelihood of receiving a COVID vaccination is available, and importantly here, there's over 20% that say that they would definitely not or probably not receive a vaccine. And this is very close in alignment with other data sources. However, the Household Pulse survey lets you break it out by characteristics, and here's just one. The distribution of the likelihood of receiving a COVID vaccine by health insurance status shows remarkable differences, and areas where the sponsor of this, the CDC, might choose to do additional outreach. Additionally, coming in March, we will be adding with the National Center for Health Statistics and CDC 4 disability questions coming to the Pulse survey. And these are part of the core set of the Washington group questions about difficulty seeing, hearing, remembering and concentrating, and walking or climbing stairs. Some lessons learned from all of this: that high frequency data becomes even more important in a crisis. Our existing data sets are invaluable. So the frames and the benchmarking that we have are critical in putting together some of these experimental products. And our partnerships with other statistical agencies and outside really were valuable in terms of developing the content, the design, and getting everything in place. And our flexible platforms, hopefully this has built a platform or a set of resources that we can use moving afterwards. And that's it. Thank you very much. And there's the website, and the presentation will be available. There are a few more slides at the end. And now I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Julie. Stop sharing, and Julie, I think it's all yours.
Thanks, Jason. And thank you everyone for having me today again at the Compendium release. It's always a great event to be part of. So this is a great segue. I think, Jason highlighted a lot of what has been going on to keep data collections going during COVID. And certainly the data collections that NCHS, the National Center for Health Statistics, is doing during COVID are also similarly impacted. So for the most part, because there's a lag between when data are collected and released for public use and when the next round is in the field, a lot of the data sources that I'm going to talk about today will reflect the year immediately prior to COVID. So what I encourage you to think about as I go through these resources is, number one, the opportunities to advance, one of the most important topics today, not only for disability, but for other vulnerable populations, and that is equity. This is not a new topic for those of us who work in the field, but it certainly is becoming a more broadly accepted issue to be addressed in our research. Secondly, a lot of the data that I'm going to talk about tees up the situation prior to COVID. And that is kind of an important, will be very important data sources for looking at changes over time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a number of data systems that NCHS collects. And in particular, I want to highlight both the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey and the National Health Interview Survey. Both of these collect disability data. Both are population-based surveys. I'm going to touch on the National Vital Statistics System. That system is not a population-based survey, and it does not collect information on disability. It is data derived from birth and death certificates. So while disability is not on there, because the population surveys are linked to the vital statistics data, you have death and cause of death outcome data for those surveys. So starting with the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, many of you know this is a fairly unique data collection, and that includes both an exam component where individuals come into the exam and have a number of things done, including physiological, medical, dental testing, as well as other laboratory specimen testing. But of course, there's also an interview component to HANES. And that component is where disability and a number of other topics are collected. So the data that are out for Haynes are the 2017 and 2018 data, because data from Haynes are released in 2-year cycles. What is being collected now is the 2019 and 2020 cycle. So you can't use those data yet, but the questionnaires are available on the website so that you can start to peruse them and tee up questions of interest for you and your research agenda. So from Haynes, you'll have, this rich examination-based data collection, which allows for disaggregation by disability status. And you get some pretty unique information, including things like hypertension, body mass index, cholesterol, and reported drug use. So that's Haynes. For many purposes, the National Health Interview Survey is the primary source of health data that you may end up wanting to use in terms of microdata. Given its size and periodicity, it's released annually, administered to about 30,000 adults, 10,000 children. And for the most part, I have talked about in previous compendium release meetings this redesign that was coming to the HIS. That redesign of the content went into the field in January of 2019. So the most recent data collection year that was released in September of 2020 is the 2019 annual data. And so as a quick reminder, the National Health Interview Survey includes the full complement of Washington Group disability questions. The disability content collected for adults is pretty vast and has been on the survey for about 10 years now. But with this 2019 redesign, there are now questions specifically for children aged 2 to 4, and children aged 5 to 17. So you have a child functioning module that with a full complement of questions there. Jason alluded to the HIS and some of this kind of rich content in the area of mental health. There is the Kessler-6, there's the Patient Health Questionnaire 9, the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Assessment, and for children, the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. And again, the idea here with HIS is most certainly you can do prevalence work, and that's important. But thinking beyond that is really thinking about the body of information collected from the HIS and looking at that to compare experiences of persons with and persons without disability. So beyond the survey microdata, as I mentioned, I wanted to circle back to this availability of vital records. I did want to mention briefly the products available from the NCHS data linkage program. This chart, which is available on the linkage webpage, gives you a sense of which survey data sources have been linked to various administrative data. And those linked data sets have the added value of combining all the survey data with information collected elsewhere. And that's primarily through administrative systems. So you can kind of see across here that there's a fair number of those systems that are linked to, for example, the health interview survey or the health and nutrition examination survey. This is a good page to watch periodically because those linkages are ongoing and continuously updated. So that's a resource for microdata. And I'm going to kind of switch over here from microdata to regularly released tabulated data in case you need a quick number or information and don't want to dig into a specific data pile. Of course, NCHS produces a number of its own reports and briefs on a regular basis. And here I've highlighted reports that were released in the past 3 months or so. These happen to all be based on HIS. And when the last data year of HIS was released in September, there was this very big push to release current information on mental health. So these items on the left are the status of nationally representative data in the year prior to the pandemic, as I said. The ones on the right just kind of highlight some of the breadth of topics that get released from the program. There are also a number of disability-specific briefs coming up, one for adults, one for children, and 2 that are methodological in nature. So what I would watch, or what I would suggest, is watching the NCHS publications page. That page provides all of the recent as well as upcoming reports that are coming out.
You're right at the 2-minute mark there.
Thanks. The HIS Early Release Program is a web page where you can get data that are tabulated, and these data are released on a quarterly basis as well as biannual. There's a drop-down menu. You can go to the menu, and for example, I chose disability status with confidence intervals, and there are the estimates for disability quarterly. Those are nationally representative. I've chatted about Health US before. That's an annual national report submitted to Congress every year. It will give you trend data for disability as well as different severity levels. And again, Health US is available online. Healthy People this year is releasing its 2030 decade. And in fact, that release of Healthy People 2030 will happen this spring. And I want to call your attention specifically to 2 items here. One is that there is this overall health and well-being measures area now, and disability will be reported on a regular basis, both life expectancy free of disability as well as the percent of the population free of disability. And all 355 objectives from Healthy People will be updated regularly with tables, including these variables. And as I noted here, disability status will be part of the disaggregation variables included for that. A couple of last comments about things in progress. There is still question development going on always. In particular in the area to add questions about psychosocial functioning, participation, for children, facilitators, and barriers to education, and then questions to identify the population with intellectual and developmental disability, which we don't have at the moment. We do have 2 web-based surveys. I specifically excluded these because until now, neither of these collect information on disability. One is RANDS and the other is Pulse, which Jason just addressed. And those will be much teed up for next year. I'm very much looking forward to getting disability on those 2 data collections. So in this last slide that you will have access to, there are a number of links to all of the pages and data sources that I have mentioned. And with that, I will turn it over to Michelle Dressner. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. I am Michelle Dressner. I am an economist working on the Occupational Requirements Survey, or ORS, at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the ORS provides information regarding job requirements in the US economy. And similar to Jason and Julie, we have been collecting this year with COVID. So I wanted to point out a couple of items before I get started. Firstly, the BLS has a page on the response to the COVID pandemic, and I can send that in the chat. and it lists all of the surveys of the BLS that have been published and the effects of COVID on those surveys. So if you'd like to know more about the effect of COVID on the ORs, you can check out the BLS page. So this presentation will start by discussing the types of estimates that are published, as well as the scope. And next, it'll highlight specific estimates for each of the 4 requirements of the ORs: physical demands, environmental conditions, education, training, and experience, cognitive and mental requirements as well. Lastly, the presentation will run through ORs tools and resources. So one type of estimate published by the ORs is the percentage of workers. So the chart on the left shows that 94% of civilian workers were required to speak as part of completing critical tasks in their job, and 6% were not required to speak. The chart on the right shows an example of speaking durations for a detailed occupation, in this case, project management specialists. Durations include 2 dimensions: the amount of time associated with the requirement and the percentage of workers with that requirement. For example, 100% of project management specialists were required to speak as part of completing critical tasks. 32.1% were required to speak occasionally, or from 2% up to 1/3 of the workday, and 67.9% were required to speak frequently, or from 1/3 to 2/3 of the workday. This chart shows the mean or average maximum weight lifted or carried by occupational group. The weight associated with the percentage of civilian workers required to lift or carry is an average of 27 pounds, as shown in the bar on the left. Next to civilian workers is office and administrative support occupations, which had an average weight lifted or carried of 9.9 pounds. The rightmost bar shows installation, maintenance, and repair occupations, which were required to lift an average of 58.1 pounds. Sometimes average estimates are in hours or days, or like you're seeing on the screen now, in pounds. So the distributions are also published when possible at the 10th, 25th, 50th, or the median, 75th, and 90th percentiles. So let's look at the percentile distribution of maximum weight lifted or carried using healthcare practitioners and technical occupations as an example. So this occupational group includes jobs like physical therapists and registered nurses, as well as jobs like medical records specialists and hearing aid specialists. The median, which was 30 pounds, is the point where 50% of workers lift or carry 30 pounds or less, and 50% lift or carry 30 pounds or more. Some notes about the survey scope. The ORs represents civilian workers. So civilian workers include workers in private industry, state government, and local government. And some major exclusions from the ORs are federal workers and military personnel, the agricultural sector, volunteers, the self-employed, and business owners. ORs estimates are published by occupation, and the Standard Occupational Classification, or SOC system, is used to classify occupations. Another important concept is that the ORs define scope of work as requirements in support of critical job functions and tasks, with the critical job function defined as the main purpose of the job and the primary factor of pay. Critical tasks are activities workers must perform to carry out critical job functions. The current estimates are for reference year 2020 and sampled data from approximately 20,000 establishments. 35,693 total estimates were published. This includes estimates for 22 occupational groups and 305 detailed occupations. The 2020 estimates are preliminary because they include only 2 sample groups. As additional sample groups are combined over the next several years, the number of occupations and requirements published will increase. The estimates will be preliminary until 5 sample groups are estimated, which is likely in 2023. As a review, there are 4 categories of job requirements: physical demands, environmental conditions, education, training, and experience, and cognitive and mental requirements. So let's start by talking about physical demands of work. Examples of physical demands include standing, sitting, climbing, and driving. It would take a while to talk about all of the estimates, so today we will highlight strength levels. This chart shows the 5 strength level requirements, sedentary through very heavy, as well as the percentage of civilian workers required to perform their jobs at each strength level. 27.4% of workers have jobs that require sedentary strength, and 1.3% of workers have jobs requiring very heavy strength. This chart shows strength levels by occupational group. Occupational groups are shown on the vertical axis of this chart, and the percentage of workers is shown on the horizontal axis. The darkest bar shows very heavy work, and the lightest shows sedentary requirements. At the top of the chart, you see that about 80% of production workers have medium or light strength requirements. 5.1% have sedentary strength as a requirement, and 13.6% have heavy strength. At the bottom, over 80% of business and financial workers have a sedentary strength requirement. Sedentary, light, and medium strength levels are the only published strength requirements for business and financial occupations, and sum to 99.8%. The next set of requirements we'll talk about are environmental conditions, which reflect the surroundings and environment of workers. Estimates include exposure to wetness, extreme heat and cold, and exposure to hazardous contaminants. They also include conditions like heights and moving mechanical parts. The required use of personal protective equipment, or PPE, is also published. Do note that for the purposes of the ORs, the use of PPE to mitigate exposure to diseases and biohazards are not included. The required use of PPE to mitigate exposure to hazardous contaminants, moving mechanical parts, heights, and loud noises are published. This chart shows the percentage of workers by occupation exposed to the outdoors. 33.8% of civilian workers are required to perform critical tasks outdoors. At the top of the chart, you see that 100% of highway maintenance workers were exposed to the outdoors. And at the bottom, you can see that 18.8% of restaurant cooks were exposed to the outdoors. Restaurant cooks might have had exposure to the outdoors when using outdoor equipment, such as grills or smokers, in spaces that do not have 3 walls and a roof, which is our definition of outdoor exposure. The ORS has information on specific vocational preparation necessary for jobs, which is time associated with completing the 4 education, training, and experience requirements in the circles on this slide. SVP is published, as well as estimates for each of the 4 individual SVP components. Let's take a look at minimum formal education required of civilian workers. On the left,
Michelle, you're right around the 2-minute mark, just so you know.
Thank you. On the left is no minimum formal education, which was required for 29.7% of workers. All the way on the right, 1.4% of workers were required to obtain a professional degree for the job. It's important to note that education in the ORs reflects the minimum formal education required to perform in jobs, not the educational attainment of the workers. For instance, if a job requires a bachelor's degree and the workers have a higher degree, such as a master's degree, the ORS requirement would still be a bachelor's degree. The last requirement we'll discuss is cognitive and mental requirements. These estimates refer to the workers' need to use judgment, make decisions, interact with others, and adapt to changes in a job. Note here that the ORS defines telework based on permanent changes as opposed to temporary arrangements, such as in response to COVID-19. This chart shows the percentage of workers in various occupations required to work around crowds. The estimates for working around crowds vary and reflect the percentage of workers meeting the following conditions: that many unfamiliar people are present compared with the space available, movement is restricted, the arrangement of the crowd is temporary, there is a certain level of disorganization, and workers are not separated from unfamiliar people by counters, dividers, or other objects. 80.7% of police and sheriff's patrol officers had this requirement, whereas 4.1% of civilian workers were required to work around crowds. So where might you find ORS estimates? They're publicly available on the ORS program webpage, which is a BLS website. So here's what the LabStat database looks like. And you can see choices for one screen or multi-screen search, depending on how you prefer to search for your estimates and data. This slide shows where the data set is available on the website in Excel format under the Supplemental Materials tab. So all ORS estimates are available in the Excel file, and they have sortable columns and labels indicating the type of estimate, as well as a column with the standard error for each estimate. On the ORS website, you can also find materials such as occupation profiles, which highlight key estimates by occupations, fact sheets, which explain ORS concepts, and text and graphics, as well as the Handbook of Methods, which explains survey methodology and a history of the ORS. Thank you so much for listening today. Here's the contact information for the ORS data line, which is staffed by economists each day that can answer your questions on the ORS. And now I'm turning over presenting to Chris McLaren.
Okay. Hi, thank you, Michelle. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here today. My name is Chris McLaren, and I'm an economist with the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the Department of Labor. And today I'm going to be talking about disability employment data and trends during COVID-19. So at ODEP, we've been closely monitoring the labor market outcomes of people with disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic, primarily relying on the monthly current population survey. Today, I'm going to present descriptive statistics from 5 COVID-19 related questions that the Bureau of Labor Statistics added to the CPS in May of 2020 to better understand the effects of COVID-19 on the labor market. Given how long it normally takes to add new questions to the CPS, it was extremely responsive to the ongoing crisis for BLS to include these in such a short time. And a quick disclaimer, I am with ODEP, so this is not an official Bureau of Labor Statistics presentation, and any errors are my own. Before I get into the CPS questions, I'd like to show some of the overall employment changes for people with and without disabilities. So this figure shows the year over year. Actually, I'm going to do full screen. Sorry, I was playing full screen. Hopefully it's better. So this figure shows the year over year percentage change in employment and employment population ratios between 2019 and 2020. The percentage change is calculated for each month in 2020 relative to the same month in 2019, which takes into account some seasonality in employment. As you can see, both groups experienced large declines in employment starting in April of 2020. And to give a sense of the magnitude, between January and April of 2020, employment for people with disabilities declined by 500,000. And for people without disabilities, it fell by about 22.8 million. As of December 2020, employment was between 5 to 10% lower compared to December of 2019. So here are the 5 CPS COVID-19 questions. The first question asks, at any time in the last 4 weeks, did you telework or work at home for pay because of the coronavirus pandemic? This was asked of employed people. The second question, at any time in the last 4 weeks, were you unable to work because your employer closed or lost business due to the coronavirus pandemic? This was asked of all people, all adults. Third question was asked of all people who answered yes to the second question, trying to find out if they received any pay from their employer for the hours that they did not work in the last 4 weeks. The fourth question asks, did the coronavirus pandemic prevent you from looking for work in the last 4 weeks? This was asked of people who are out of the labor force. And the fifth question asked, at any time in the last 4 weeks, did you need medical care for something other than the coronavirus, but not get it because of the coronavirus? And this was asked of all adults. Throughout this presentation and some of the figures I'm going to show, people with disabilities are represented in blue and people without disabilities are represented in orange. Any boxed percentage for people with disabilities indicates that it is statistically different from people without disabilities at the 10% significance level or lower or better. So this slide presents the percentage of people who said that they teleworked or worked at home for pay because of the coronavirus pandemic. A higher percentage of people in both groups reported teleworking in May 2020 compared to more recent months, shortly after the pandemic began. And rates fell until October, but we do see a slight increase in November. Across the board, a lower percentage of people with disabilities reported teleworking compared to those without, and the difference was statistically significant in each month. The overall average, which are shown on the right, is looking at between the months May and November, and that has that approximately 1/4 of people without disabilities said that they teleworked compared to about 1/5 of people with disabilities. And then the very far right bars, they show a regression adjusted overall average. This average adjusts for gender, race, education, age, and occupation group. When we take those factors into account, there were no statistically different rates in telework, which means that the differences that we're seeing could likely be explained by differences in education and occupations, which are highly correlated with telework. But regardless of any adjustment, a lower percentage of people with disabilities teleworked. This is important because preliminary work we've done at ODEP and also other published research has found that being in a job that may feasibly be done at home is associated with better employment outcomes, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this slide shows variation in telework by disability and occupation group using the May to November average. There is a clear separation between high and low telework occupation groups. So professional and related occupations had the highest rates. These include computer occupations, architects, engineers, scientists, education, legal, healthcare practitioners are also in there. People with disabilities had lower rates of telework in the top 2 telework occupation groups. So professional and related, in management, business, and finance. And those differences were statistically significant. However, there were no significant differences in most of the low occupation telework occupation groups. The second question asks whether a person was unable to work because their employer closed or lost business due to COVID-19. So this question was asked of everyone, but this slide only shows the results for those who are in the labor force. Among the employed on the left-hand side of this slide, 14% of people with disabilities said they were unable to work at some point in the last 4 weeks, compared to 10.5% for people without disabilities. So someone who is employed and responds that they were unable to work indicates underemployment rather than unemployment. But among the unemployed, when we look at the other bars, just less than half of people with disabilities said it was because of the pandemic, compared to just more than half of people without disabilities. Overall, when we combine the groups and look at the percentage in the labor force, 18.5% of people with disabilities said they were unable to work because of the pandemic. And that was statistically higher than the percentage of people without disabilities. And when we do some regression adjustments for gender, age, race, education, and industry, the percentages are still significantly higher for people with disabilities. So this slide shows the variation in being unable to work by disability and industry. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, except to note that the percentage of people with disabilities who said that they were unable to work because of the pandemic was statistically higher than people without disabilities in a number of industries. The higher percentage of workers who said they were unable to work were in the leisure and hospitality and other services industries. Leisure and hospitality includes things like arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food services. Other services is a mix that includes things like auto and electronic repair and maintenance, barbershops, beauty salons, personal care, dry cleaning, grant making and giving services. So it's a real variety. Okay, so this, the third question was asked among all people who said they were unable to work because their employer closed or lost business to COVID, to determine if the person received pay from their employer for the hours not worked. This provides some insight into the safety net available to workers who are either underemployed or lost their job. The top bar shows that overall, only 12.3% of people with disabilities who were unable to work because of the pandemic said they received pay from their employer for the time not worked, compared to 15.3% of people without disabilities, and that difference is statistically significant. This figure also shows how rates of pay vary by industry. The highest percentage of people said they received pay in the public administration industry, though people with disabilities reported a statistically lower percentage in that same industry. The second highest rates were in the education and health services industry, is likely workers in both public administration and in education and health services may have greater employment protections and so are more likely to get paid for time not worked. Some of the lowest rates of people reporting pay for the time not worked were in the leisure and hospitality industry and the other services industry. This is concerning because some of the largest declines in employment have actually occurred in those industries. A fourth question was asked among those out of the labor force if the pandemic prevented them from searching for work. So this slide shows a percentage of people who said that it did prevent them from searching for work in each month between May and November, with overall averages reported on the right. So a smaller percentage of people with disabilities reported that the pandemic prevented them from searching for a job, and there wasn't much variation across months. Whereas for people without disabilities, there is a noticeable decline across the months. Overall, 2.8% of people with disabilities said the pandemic prevented them from searching for work, compared to 6.7% of people without disabilities. When we regression adjust for gender, race, education, and age, the estimated percent for people with disabilities goes up to 4.5%, but it is still lower than for people without disabilities. The fifth and final question asked whether a person needed medical care for something other than COVID-19, but did not get it because of the pandemic. we see a higher percentage of people with disabilities saying that they did not get medical care, and the difference is statistically significant. One factor that may drive this difference is age. People with disabilities, at least in the current population survey, are generally older than people without disabilities. But when we adjust for age, as well as gender, race, education, and whether the person is employed or not, which is shown on the right-hand side, a statistically significant difference remains. A likely explanation for this difference is that people with disabilities need more medical care generally, so are more likely to have needed medical care for something other than COVID. As to why they did not get it, it is possible that there was limited access as healthcare providers focused on COVID. And it is also possible that people didn't get it because of concerns over the risks of going to see a healthcare provider. This figure shows the same issue as the last, access to medical care, but looking at it by age group. So as expected, a lower, and it shows it for overall and for only people who are employed. As expected, a lower percentage of employed people reported that they were not able to get care compared to the overall for each group, but the difference is not that great. What is interesting is that age was really not driving this difference in access to medical care. We generally see a rising percentage as age increases, but it is clear that there are differences across all age groups between people with and without disabilities. So in summary, between May 2020 and November 2020, relative to those people without disabilities, those with disabilities have teleworked at lower rates. Though differences may be explained by other characteristics, they have reported being unable to work at higher rates. They have received pay for time not worked at lower rates. They reported a lower impact on preventing job search for those out of the labor force, and they have not been able to access medical care for non-COVID related conditions at higher rates. So as I finish up here, I do want to reiterate how valuable it was for BLS to incorporate these questions into the CPS. And as far as I know, they will continue for the time being. And at ODEP, we'll be continuing to monitor the employment outcomes of people with disabilities to inform our work. And I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you very much. And I'll pass this back over to Kirstin.
Oh, you're still muted, Kirstin. There you go.
How about now?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that. So we'll go ahead and get into the question and answer. And remember, if you have a question, please type it down into the question and answer at the bottom of the screen. And I'll come up here. Let's see. So the first question is, heard about guidance on data collection for COVID infection rates amongst people with disabilities. The federal report said specific guidance would be forthcoming from the CDC. Do you have any further information?
Anybody have any more information, Julie?
No. I mean, one answer is that I don't work in the infectious disease division that is most closely aligned with, the people who are putting out the guidance. And there is guidance out today, new, but it's for the entire population. I'm not aware of specific guidance that will target actions to be taken by the community with disability. So most of these are for everyone.
Can I do a follow-up question on that?
Absolutely.
For the whole panel?
Yep.
How are group quarters being treated, particularly institutional? This was referenced in a question that's already been answered. For individuals that are still online, there's a lot of really neat questions that the panelists have already answered in the Q&A. it might be worth a quick scan to see if questions are answered. But could you talk a little bit about what's being done about group quarters?
So real quickly, I think the household pulse survey does not include group quarters in the survey frame. It's the household frame is what we use. But surveys like the American Community Survey do have a group quarters component of their sample. Other than that, most of our surveys are too small to really be able to address the group quarters population.
Yeah.
Jason, just to follow up, if, for example, in ACS, there is a group quarter identified and included, those are being handled by telephone, I assume. I mean, just like all of the others right now, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And
I didn't know if
there's some-
Andrew's question was specifically how are they being handled right now during COVID data collection
Yes.
or in general?
Yeah.
Both,
Okay.
both.
Yeah, they would be being contacted in the same manner as our household population by telephone to reduce the risk to our interviewers and to the occupants.
But there's no like recent, more like contemporaneous data for that
No.
population. Yeah. It's an interesting population that's been quite vulnerable, both either skilled nursing facilities or small group homes has been a major concern.
And certainly the decennial operations that continued throughout the course of the pandemic did go into reach out to all of those institutional living arrangements. So I'm getting weird. But they continued to access them mostly by phone and through a trusted contact person, administrators and whatnot.
It was so good, it was worth saying twice with an
Yeah.
echo. I'll turn it back to Chris. Do you see any other, Kirstin, do you see any other questions?
Sure. Yeah, there's several here. So this next one, I believe this one is for Julie. I'm not 100%. Says from the initial information on the Healthy People 2030 website, it appears that disability is represented both as a subpopulation, health disparities population, and as a health measure to be reduced. Could you clarify? For example, how can we support public health and other partners to understand that they need to engage the disability community to address life year disparities experienced by people with disabilities and to prevent secondary conditions and promote health with the population?
Sure. So disability will be in Healthy People in two places. One, there are specific objectives, and specific objectives have targets. And so there are 5 disability-related objectives for the 2030 decade, and none of them are to reduce the prevalence of disability in the population. That in and of itself is not an objective. Those 5 objectives are differently crafted so that it is, reduce the proportion of adults with disabilities who experience serious psychological distress, or reduce the proportion of adults with disabilities who delay getting preventive care because of cost. So yes, disability is in the specific objectives, but it is not a targeted objective to reduce the prevalence of disability in the population. That's why in the presentation, I highlighted the overall health and well-being measures, because that's the only place in Healthy People where you will find the prevalence of disability over time. How you talk to and advocate for increased access to disability services and improved health outcomes with the patient provider or the healthcare provider community is a very different question and probably would take up a lot of time here. But in general, it all boils down to a great deal is data, our data. We just don't have disability being collected in all of the places that it needs to be collected for data for healthcare providers to make informed decisions and implement differential practices. But if you want to reach me offline, I'll be happy to expand.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here. This one looks like it's to Chris and Michelle. It says, does BLS or ODEP have access to UC data from the state? It would be interesting to see how the CPS data compare to similar questions asked of people currently on UC or PUA.
Go ahead, Michelle. If you, do you want to take this one?
I was going to bounce it to you because my answer would be I would need to check with my CPS colleagues at BLS. The ORS is an establishment-based survey, so we have we collect data through having field economists collect with respondents who are from establishments. But if you're interested specifically in CPS, feel free to reach out to them or reach out to me and I can connect you with them.
And at ODEP, we don't have, I agree, it would be interesting, but we don't have that access either. So I, following up like Michelle recommends to BLS would be the way to go.
Thank you, guys. Here's a key issue here is how are people with disabilities defined and counted for all these reports? Granularly, it's helpful in order to detect and remedy accessibility gaps. So I guess that's for everyone.
This is Andrew. I think that I think this is a really important issue, and it took me a while to figure out what you meant by granularity, but I think it's by disability type. And can you guys, any of you, talk about whether your analyses will look at specific disability types?
I'm happy to answer first. In terms of the content in all of the NCHS presentation, disability is a dichotomous yes/no measure, and it is created from the Washington Group's 6 questions, and it right now any of the analyses can be done defined by any disability, or you can look at a specific domain of functioning, whether that's vision, hearing, mobility, cognition, self-care, or communication. So but I do highlight, this issue because oftentimes what we're lacking is how was it defined? Did it use this set of questions? Did it use, that set of 6 questions? Or did it use some shorter number of questions, and then you can't benchmark across any of these data sets? So it's an important thing to watch for.
I'll just
have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just briefly add about the CPS, and actually I had considered, so the CPS uses the same 6 disability questions to determine if someone has a disability as used in the American Community Survey and a number of other major public surveys. But, again, as mentioned earlier, it varies across a number of different surveys. In the CPS, there are the six questions, and they are yes or no, but essentially someone is categorized as having a disability if they answer yes to any one of those 6 questions. I think some of the analyses are, especially when looking at employment, for instance, looking whether someone only has one impairment reported or do they have multiple, that can be useful to look at. I was actually considering presenting some differences by disability type when looking at the access to medical care. question that I presented a few minutes ago, thinking that was particularly relevant. The problem in the CPS is that when you start breaking things down into groups as they get smaller and smaller, especially if you're looking at monthly data, the sample just gets really small to be able to say much about it. And a lot of the variation can be due just to sampling variation across months. So it is a challenge in the CPS, but certainly looking at the different measures used across surveys is really critical when making those comparisons.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have anything they want to add? Okay, we'll move on. This next question is, there are many studies that put in demographics such as age, race, and gender. Most leave out disability. Not everyone with a disability knows they would have been seen as having a disability. Hence, someone who has a non-visible disability might answer that they don't have a disability, even if they have one. Is there a sample, maybe a simple way of looking at a way that you think is the best practice for how to ask a disability demographic question so that it can be collected and analyzed?
And this will be our last question before we close out, just so everybody knows.
I'll take a first stab. It's important to recognize that when you see a dichotomous yes/no disability indicator, that the question, that the item that populates that dichotomy is not a question that says, do you have a disability? I don't know of any federal data collection that includes a question that says, do you have a disability? What these questions ask is, do you have difficulty seeing? Do you have difficulty hearing? Do you have difficulty walking or climbing stairs, or with self-care, or with making decisions and concentrating? So the question is, do you have difficulty? The way that the dichotomy, how you get into a yes/no, is you either answer yes to one of those, or you, if the question asks about severity, you answer a lot of difficulty or unable to do. And that's what kind of gets you into that yes question. So you're absolutely right that, you know, it's what highlights that asking the question, do you have a disability? That's a really bad survey question. Don't ever ask that, because there are a lot of people, you know, for very different reasons, including stigma, who would not answer yes to that.
Right, and I just add to that, and I see, Jennifer, that you have a sample question that you've put in the chat as well. I think the thing you need to be concerned about as you try to measure disability is who you're asking and what unit level you're trying to develop a measure for. You want to be careful about asking by proxy, and you want to be careful about, you know, making sure that if you're trying to develop prevalence estimates at the person level, that you ask the right questions. And the ones proposed by the Washington group at the moment are the current standard, and the answer categories, either with the severity levels or the yes/no, is how we're doing that. And you're right that it's a component of you know, maybe it should be more prominent in demographic sections of surveys than it is. So
Yeah, that's a, you know, and also once it's asked, to get it into the actual publications is another step as well.
Right.
All right, well, I'm going to share my screen and thank everybody. Thank you to the presenters. Thank you to all the participants. We'll be mailing you out an evaluation form. Thank you to the moderator too. Thank you to NIDILRR, our funding agency. And thank you to our partners that are part of the Statistics Center, Kessler Foundation, AUCD, and Mathematica Policy Research. Again, thank you to all the presenters again. We'll stay on and try to answer some of the questions in the questions that are still open in the Q&A box. And Kate has just posted the materials where you can find the materials and where you can find our evaluation form. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon.